Do you ever feel we might be living in a simulation or something similar to VR? And have you ever experienced time slowing down or speeding up while playing your favorite video game? Well, you can say thank you to time compression for that one. Nicolas Davidenko, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of California, speaks with me about his psychology research on how virtual reality warps our sense of time, how time compression can help us in medical fields and other related industries, the concept of self living in and out of virtual worlds, and simulation theory in direct correlation to virtual reality. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Thanks for joining us on Rebelliously Curious. So you are the associate professor at the University of California and looking into psychology or working within the psychology field. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into that field, and then along with the high level perception lab? Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been working at UC Santa Cruz for 9 years now as an associate professor of psychology. My background is actually in several different fields. I started by studying math as an undergraduate, and then went into statistics and psychology and neuroscience, and I'm back to psychology, and I'm interested in perception, and more specifically high-level perception. And what I mean by high-level perception is perception of complicated stimuli like faces or scenes or objects. Perception that involves interaction between senses, so auditory and visual interactions or vestibular and visual interactions, as well as aspects of perception that can be modulated by attention or expectations or other top-down processes. So that's sort of my approach to my research, is to look at these interesting aspects of perception and studying them from kind of a cognitive psychology perspective, using mathematical and computational tools to better understand mechanisms and also to use methodologies and analysis.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the High Perception Lab as well, and what your kind of work you're doing there? There was one press release that came out that you are researching and using VR, virtual reality,
Mhm.
and how it has our perception of time and how it can be warped. So can you tell us a little bit about the High Perception Lab, and then along with the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, definitely. So my lab is the high-level perception lab, and we investigate, like I was saying, lots of different aspects of perception. We use eye tracking methods, we use virtual reality, and a lot of computational and behavioral approaches. In our virtual reality parts, we've been studying different aspects of perception. Virtual reality is an incredible tool to manipulate what people see. So you can use virtual reality to, for example, manipulate how much the two eyes agree about what they see, presenting images to only one eye or to the other, and studying binocular rivalry. We've also used virtual reality to manipulate the tilt of the environment for people. So what happens if you step into an environment that's tilted? Eventually, you kind of adapt to that tilt. And so we're interested in the processes of how we adapt, how we kind of ignore what our vestibular system is telling us and start trusting what our visual system is telling us. And then most recently, I've been working, like you mentioned, on time perception. And this work really derived from an undergraduate in my lab at the time who was a cognitive science major. And he had been using, he's a gamer, and he had been using virtual reality a lot and had really felt this experience of time kind of seeming to fly by after being in a virtual reality environment. And he decided to propose an experiment to investigate that time compression effect. I'll be happy to tell you more about that study. But basically, this kind of shows a range of the kind of things we do in the high level perception lab.
What is time compression? Because some
Yes.
people might not understand what that terminology is, and then how it relates to psychology, how it relates to then VR, and then our own reality and perception of reality.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'll be honest, I wasn't too aware of the term either a few years ago. So this all kind of started for me when Grace and Mullen approached me about designing the study and looking into the literature on how we perceive time. There's kind of two types of effects that can happen: time dilation and time compression. And they're kind of opposites. So time dilation is when you feel like a long time has gone by, but in reality, it's been a little bit of time. So you feel like you've been doing something for an hour and you look and the clock's only been 10 minutes, to exaggerate. Time compression is the opposite. It's the feeling where you don't think that much time has gone by, but in reality, more time has gone by. That is the classic effect that that Gray, as well as other people, have sort of noticed anecdotally, that being in a virtual environment has this time compression effect. When you leave the environment, you think maybe 15 minutes has gone by, and it's really been half an hour or 45 minutes. And there's a lot of interesting implications of that, and in terms of, like, you know, harmful effects that might have in society, or positive effects that might have in certain contexts. And there's a lot of really interesting questions about how the brain computes time, and what is it telling us about that process that this happens with virtual reality.
Yeah, because it's not just virtual reality. Like, we'll be using it within our practical life. So what
Mhm,
are those elements that, instead of somebody jumping in, because every time we think of virtual reality, we think gaming automatically.
mhm.
So what is the future going to look like with the idea of using time compression within our daily lives? And how does that play into our daily lives? And what are the things that we'll be using? Will it be medical based? Will it be, for maybe if different industries like infrastructure, like how do we use time compression and how will it positively affect us?
Yeah, well, these are great questions, and we only have some ideas about, some possible directions. And like you mentioned, in the medical field, there are lots of times where it's desirable to have people experience the passage of time more quickly. If undergoing a painful treatment or an uncomfortable procedure that takes 2 hours, if you can make it feel like it only took 1 hour by immersing somebody in a virtual experience, that can have, positive effects. Now, virtual reality is not the only thing that leads to time compression. So just off the bat, any engaging activity, like being really immersed in a game, or really immersed in a book, or really immersed in any kind of activity, can lead to time compression effects, as compared to being in a more inactive state. Um, just that virtual reality enhances that effect.
Interesting. So here's a here's a question maybe you can answer or not. When we look at worlds, right? Like, we might use these terms in literature where it's like, our first world, our primary worlds, our secondary worlds, and then our tertiary worlds. When we start to integrate VR into our daily lives, and this could be from years from now, how do we perceive what is then our primary reality? Because at that point, isn't our primary reality technically that we think is would be our secondary reality, because what's going on around us is technically our primary primary
Mhm.
reality, but our secondary is something that we've put in. So how do we does our secondary reality become our primary reality? Have
Yeah.
we even looked at that? Because it will change everything of how we perceive self at time.
Absolutely. I think so. One concept that is really come to this surface recently in psychology is this concept of presence, which is different than immersion. we have just been talking about in terms of like when you become really immersed in a game or an activity or a book. Presence is actually more of a your understanding of where you physically are. And virtual reality has an ability to manipulate our sense of presence in a way that nothing else has before, I think. So you could be in a lab room, right? In an experiment room, you put the VR set on, and now you are flying through space, and or you're underwater and looking at sea life around you. You really, really quickly forget that you're really in that lab room. You have all the visual cues. Sometimes you have auditory cues, haptic, tactile cues that are all consistently telling you you're in this other environment. And although you might have part of your brain that still remembers that there's like a real reality out there that you can return to when you take the headgear off, most of your brain doesn't realize that, right? Most of your brain and your body just acts as if that is your actual space where you live. So the question that you're bringing up about, will there be a time in the future where that becomes like somebody's primary reality? I think it's very possible. It kind of depends on how much time does a person spend in that virtual space.
Yeah, because we have games like Second Life right now that are some people's primary reality, but they're literally sitting in their own primary reality, but engaged into a secondary reality. So I'm really curious to see how that's going to evolve over time. Then,
Yeah.
even with that said, how do we see perception of self then? Because once we start moving into a gaming world, we have things like avatars. We can change the way we look. We can change the way that we experience our reality. We can change our own abilities. So how does the perception of self then change?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that comes up not just in virtual reality, but like in gaming and also in social media, right? It's like people create avatars or different versions of themselves to portray in different platforms or in different social contexts. I think there's I don't know. I mean, it's a complicated question, right? Like, how does your sense of self change?
Right.
I think people start maybe feeling more kind of like compartmentalized selves, like divided selves. Like, this is me on Facebook, this is me on Twitter, or this is me in Second City, or this is Sim City, etc. Right? Like, and when you can manipulate the way you look or sound, I think people tend to sort of have different versions of themselves kind of coexisting.
Yeah, and we'll see over time. Maybe we haven't got there yet. Maybe when VR is more integrated into our daily lives. Are there any experiments or anything that, research related that will and have, alluded to that it will be happening in our daily lives? Like, for example, we put on, a larger headset to be part of VR. Are we going to maybe put on something smaller where we just put on glasses and we walk around? What is, is there any research around that of that might be happening?
So I think I was just going to say that, yes. So headsets are getting smaller and lighter. It will be more feasible to wear them for longer periods of time without discomfort. There's also, what are some concerns about extended VR usage? It could be like cyber sickness that some people experience. A lot of people actually experience. Kind of like dizziness or motion sickness that can come with VR, which is related to cue conflict. So you might be moving in a certain way in a virtual space, but your vestibular system doesn't feel that movement. And so there's a conflict between visual cues, vestibular cues that can create motion sickness. Those are all things that people are working on with the goal of being able to wear VR for longer periods of time. And at the same time, I was mentioning that augmented reality, or AR, is also growing. And these are almost always lighter glasses because they have to be somewhat see-through, because you're in your world, you see things around you, you see yourself, but also you see other things that aren't really there. It could be representations of people talking to you. It could be, signs or information about things in your environment.
Yeah. The gear and things that we'll
Mhm.
be using to implement in our daily lives is really interesting to me. And I wonder if you know this. I've actually asked people this other question, just friends and what they think around this concept of the Neurolink.
Mhm.
So we know that Elon Musk is developing something that will help with neurological diseases and maybe then later on in the future be able to upload our own memories. How will there at one point do you think that there will be a merge of VR in the Neurolink consistently? And then will that be something that will be implemented where people will be able to have both rather than wearing the gear? The gear would be inside of you. It's really sci-fi, but it could be a possibility. Do you know if anyone's talking about that right now?
Um, I, I don't know. I don't know much
It's
about that.
okay. It's
I'll be
okay.
honest.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think, wearable technology, even like Fitbits or smartwatches that monitor your heart rate and other things. And, you can wear EEG machines and walk around that also measure brain activity. So it's not a far stretch to have some implant, different positions that measure more direct neural activity, or even can feed stimuli to the brain. Um, in terms of like uploading your memories or contents of your mind in that way, I think we're still really far from that. From coming from a sort of a neuroscience point of view, I think we're just beginning to decipher how large populations of neurons code information, encode information. There's some really fascinating work that's coming out on implants that patients who have motor cortex or aphasia, can't express themselves by speaking, can think of words to say, and the algorithm can kind of learn what neural signals are associated with different words. So the other way around could also work, right? You could have information being fed into your brain in a more direct way than we're used to. But I think we're pretty far still.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's so sci-fi.
Right.
I hope I'm 80 when that happens, to be honest. I don't
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
if I'm going to be able to handle that. Maybe a different generation can take us through that journey. Um, what kind of experiments? Like, how do you measure this? Like, how
Mhm.
do you go in the high perception lab and figure out, okay, we're going to create an experiment to measure these things, and then come out with some information and some analytics around it? Like, what are those experiments that you do, and then how do you go about figuring out which experiments you're going to try and use?
Yeah. So my lab lives within the psychology department. So most of the measurements that we do are behavioral. That means people, responding to questions, like kind of self-report, like tell us, like, what does this feel like, or like, those are like standard tools. We use more like implicit ways. So like we measure reaction time to respond to different stimuli, um, or we also go a little bit more implicit and look at eye movements. Eye movements are interesting because they happen faster than more like conscious decision making. So for example, if you are being asked to select an item on the screen, you might end up clicking on an item, but before you do, your eyes already moved there. So your eyes are actually telling us more about what you're thinking and what you're doing than your finger button presses. So when we design our experiments, we sort of have those tools available. Like what can people do? What can they say? How quickly can they press buttons? Where are they looking? Other researchers in my department use neuroimaging tools or EEG to measure, a more comprehensive set of brainwaves that are happening as a participant does things. But it's always tricky to measure what you want to measure. So I think the whole field of psychology, is just figuring out ways to get at the answers we want to get at with these very basic tools that we have to measure things.
Yeah, and here's a question that maybe is not sure if we can answer, but is culture even a part of that when you're looking to take people into these experiments? Is what are you looking for people to partake in this? We're doing a sample of people, let's say it's 10 people. Are they from all different ethnicities? Are they all different educational backgrounds? Like, what do you look for in the type of candidate that can work on these experiments with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that's actually been changing in the last couple of years because of COVID and the remote research that's been developing. But honestly, it's actually a pretty limited sample. So I would say that most psychology related studies that get conducted at universities in the US are based on undergraduate populations because of convenience only, right? It's not because we only want to study that population, but that's the population that is around taking psychology courses and that have incentives to participate in psychology studies. Of course, there's like other populations to look at that are important. So aging populations, younger populations, people who are not in college, right? We as a field don't do enough of that, like kind of recruiting diverse populations. I think part of it is because it costs more money because, like I mentioned, psychology students kind of come for free. They get course credit for participation in studies. Everyone else we have to pay. And so that requires grants and more infrastructure. But I think there's still a push to diversify the subject population as much as possible. And when we get our studies are always reviewed and approved by a committee, a university-wide committee that makes sure that the studies are ethical and that the benefits outweigh the risks, et cetera. And they also are ensuring that people are being recruited sort of in a way that is inclusive, that promotes diversity, and that doesn't leave people behind.
Yeah, I think it's really important. We're living in a generation where diversity has to be acknowledged in all different aspects, if it's science, if it's technology. But also the question would, if somebody is not used to living in, let's say, if they're in a developing nation or they're in, in something, they're living in a Western culture, their perception of time and their perception of, especially if they've never used VR before, would it be different than, say, somebody living in North America? Would their perception of time be a lot quicker or would it be slower just because of the environment that they're in by cause and effect? It's not generally their, it wouldn't be their, it's because of the area that they were brought up in. They're not around this type of technology. So
Yeah.
are we even able to evaluate, or are we going to even go down that road to evaluate that with other people in different cultures?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so just from a really big picture point of view,
Yeah.
there's huge differences in the way that people perceive time and people report perceiving time and the way that people talk about time in different cultures. So there are ways like that time perception differs linguistically. So like, for example, we tend to think of time as like a line, like a spatial line. And for if you grew up in a Western, well, let's just say if you grew up in the US where we read from left to right, you kind of think of the past as being over there and the future as being over there. Or sometimes like the past is behind you and the future is like in front of you. Like we have like spatial ways that we refer to time. And other cultures do it differently. So some cultures do it from like high to low, for example. High is the future and low is the past. So just from and I'll also add that we mark time in different ways. Like in English, for example, we must use a tense. If I say I kicked the ball, like that's a past tense. I can't just say I generically kick the ball, future, past, or present, doesn't matter, right? we mark time, and in other cultures that's not necessary linguistically, so it can be ambiguous if you're referring to the past or future. So that's just to lay like a little bit of groundwork to say that cross-culturally there's big differences in time perception. I would also say that a culture that's never been exposed to virtual reality would probably have huge effects of it. So huge time compression because of the novelty, because of the unusual aspects of it.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see what other cultures around the world and their psychology and then their experiments with and collaborating together to see what they come out with.
Yes.
Because it would be interesting to see what our perception of reality and time is and how it is for somebody else, and they might only live in an 8-hour flight away, but it could be
Mhm.
totally different than how we perceive it. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's fascinating.
I mean, I think that, just there's already ways to kind of see that even within a culture, because there are experts and non-experts, right? Like when we bring participants in the lab, we always ask them like, have you ever used VR before? And if you have, like how many times and what context, like how many hours do you think you've used the total? And we think, I mean, that matters, right? Like the first ever time you use VR, it's like kind of mind blowing. But then like the 20th time you use VR, okay, it's like you're past that phase, right? So like the question is like how much of it is like the novelty factor? How much is it something that's going to persist?
Yeah. Now I really want to go into the concept of simulation theory because it's interesting that you're studying VR, which is in its own context, obviously a simulation. And then now we have this idea that we're living in a simulation. So, do any of those worlds cross in experiments, or have you looked at simulation theories while you're doing these experiments?
We haven't done that in my lab, no.
Okay. Is
But
your thought perception changed because of, working in this? Are you more interested in simulation theory, or do you feel that it's not even something that we should consider? Because I believe they say it's like 50% of chance that we live in a simulation.
I've read that. I can't put my mind around it, to be honest. Like
Experience. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't understand the argument enough to see how they get to 50-50. Um, I know, I mean, VR is certainly a simulation, right? So, but from my point of view, like, okay, what did it take to create VR? And people have been working on it for decades. And in the 80s, there was like the first kind of attempt to launch virtual reality platforms, and they went nowhere. And they went nowhere because the technology wasn't good enough. The frame rate was too slow, and especially the response time, the lag time was too slow. So for virtual reality to work, the moment you turn your head, the whole scene has to update immediately. It has to show you what it would look like if you were looking over there instead of over here. And it has to be within like 5 milliseconds. And if there's any delay greater than 5 milliseconds, it no longer looks like a world. It looks like a screen. So when I think about the parallel between this and like simulation theory, I just think, oh, it would take a lot. It would take a lot of computing power.
Yeah, it's true. It's a lot of computing power.
Yeah.
Just so with that said, can you tell us a little bit about the experiments that you're working on currently in the high perception lab?
Yes. So we have lots of different studies happening. One area of research that's fairly new to me, which I'm really excited about, is music perception and cognition. And I have a grad student who's studying the phenomenon of earworms, which is when you have a song stuck in your head. And it's something that most people experience at one point or another during the day. And we're using a methodology called experience sampling to try to get at it. So participants who sign up for our study get notifications several times a day over the course of a week that say, is there music in your head right now? And you say yes or no. And if you say yes, then it prompts you to record what you're hearing in your head. So try to sing as accurately as possible what was going on in your head, including lyrics or any other information, pitch, rhythm, about what was happening. So I can't tell you any of the actual details of the results. We're still analyzing and writing this paper up for publication, but there's some really, really interesting findings in terms of just how much people have music in their head, and the types of the musical elements that are included in those experiences.
That's awesome. So that is our time. And I wanted to say thank you, Nicolas, for being rebelliously curious with me.
Thank you so much for having me.